Good evening and welcome back. If you're here, settle in. Pull the covers up a little. Let the room around you go quiet. Tonight, we are not going to talk about kings. We are not going to talk about battles or conquerors or men on horseback arriving at the gates of cities with fire and glory behind them. Tonight, we are going somewhere much quieter than that. Tonight, we follow the ordinary people. The ones who got up before the sun rose fully over the horizon. The ones who ate a simple breakfast, a heel of bread, maybe a cup of something warm. The ones who picked up the same tool they had used yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that, and walked to the same place and did the same thing they would do tomorrow. History has a habit of remembering the dramatic, the great speech given just before the battle, the treaty signed in candlelight, the moment the walls came down. But most of human history was not made of moments. It was made of mornings, slow, grey, ordinary mornings where someone somewhere needed to do a thing that no one would remember them for doing. We are going to spend time with some of those people tonight. And as you listen, as we move from one quiet world to the next, you might find the weight of the day beginning to lift from you. These stories are slow by design. They were slow by nature. The people who lived them measured time not by the drama of events, but by the rhythm of the work itself. So wherever you are right now, lying down, drifting, eyes already soft at the edges, let me take you somewhere very far away and very long ago, to a desk by a single candle, to a stone bench in a dim Roman room, to a road of packed earth that stretches as far as the eye can reach, to a hillside in the late afternoon where the only sound is wind through dry grass and the faint, distant clinking of bells. Let's begin. Part 1. The Scribe. The room at the edge of everything. Imagine a room, not a large room. Stone walls maybe a meter thick enough to keep the worst of the winter out, though not entirely. The floor is bare, the ceiling is low. There are 2 windows, small ones, set high in the wall, and on clear days they let in a wedge of yellow light that moves across the floor as slowly as a sundial's shadow. This is the scriptorium. It is a word that comes from the Latin scriptorium, a place for writing. And in the monasteries of medieval Europe, from roughly the 6th century onward, it was the heart of something remarkable, the preservation of almost everything the Western world had written down. Every piece of philosophy, theology, history, poetry, and law that survived from ancient Rome and Greece. Almost all of it survived because of rooms like this one, and the people inside them. But the people inside them, to put it plainly, had one of the most repetitive jobs in human history. Their task was to copy. That was it. To sit, to dip a quill into ink, and to copy, word for word, letter for letter, a text that already existed onto a fresh piece of parchment. Then to do the same thing again tomorrow and the day after. Before the sun is fully up. You are a monk in a monastery somewhere in the rolling country of northern Europe. The year is somewhere around the 9th century, though the exact year barely matters. The rhythm of your days has been almost identical for years now, and will continue to be for years more. You woke before dawn. You did not choose to. The bells woke you. You attended a service in the chapel, the prayers rising in the cold dark like breath made into sound. Then you had a little time. Your rule, the structured code of conduct that governed monastic life, prescribed how every hour of the day should be spent. Work, prayer, reading, sleep. That was the shape of a day, repeated. Now it is morning, and you have settled at your desk. Your desk is a slanted wooden surface, angled toward you so the parchment lies flat and your quill can move across it without dragging. The design, as described in the famous 9th century plan of St. Gall, a detailed architectural blueprint for an ideal Benedictine monastery, showed 7 such desks, arranged around a central table in the scriptorium, oriented toward the windows to catch the most consistent light. Rooms like this were oriented to face north where possible, to avoid the harsh glare of direct southern sunlight that could cast shadows on the page and make precise copying even harder. In front of you is the exemplar, the book you are copying from. It is propped open, and your eyes move from it to your own blank page in a rhythm so practiced it has become almost unconscious. Look, translate the letter shapes through your hand, move the quill, dip, blow gently to let the ink dry, look again. Your quill is a goose feather, trimmed and shaped at the tip into a precise point. The ink in the small clay vessel to your right was made from a mixture of oak gall, iron salts, and water. It is dark now, almost black, but will fade slightly to a warm brown as it ages across centuries. You do not know that. You only know it needs to be thin enough to flow, but thick enough not to bleed into the grain of the parchment. What parchment feels like. The parchment itself deserves a moment. It is not paper. It is scraped animal skin, usually sheep or calf, treated over weeks into a thin, pale, slightly translucent surface. Touching it with your fingers too long leaves oils that interfere with the ink. You have learned to rest your wrist on a small piece of cloth or to hold your hand slightly raised above the page. After years of this, the muscles along your forearm and shoulder have developed their own particular kind of tiredness at the end of the day, a dull ache that runs from your wrist up through your neck. A 10th century prior, quoted in later historical records, described the physical experience of extended copying with striking directness. He wrote that it dims your eyes, makes your back ache, and knits your chest and belly together. He called it a terrible ordeal for the whole body. He was not dramatizing. Studies of skeletal remains from monastic populations have confirmed patterns of wear consistent with prolonged bent-forward posture and fine motor stress in the hands. The sound of the scriptorium. What you notice, sitting in this room, is the sound, or rather, the near-total absence of it. The scriptorium operated in mandatory quiet. This was not merely a preference, it was a rule. Conversation during copying hours was prohibited. If a monk needed something, a fresh quill, a different text, help interpreting a difficult passage, there was a system of hand signs by which requests could be communicated without breaking the silence. Historians of medieval monastic life have documented these gestural vocabularies, little sign languages developed purely so that scribes could work without a spoken word passing between them. So the room is quiet, profoundly, almost oppressively quiet. The only sounds are the faint scratch of quill on parchment, the occasional rustle of a page being turned in the exemplar, the distant sound of wind pressing against the thick stone walls, and sometimes, if the monastery is near a forest, the call of a bird from somewhere outside. A sound so different from the room's interior that it seems to arrive from another world entirely. You copy. You have been copying for 2 hours. You will copy for 4 more before the next bell calls you to prayer. What you are copying. The text in front of you might be a gospel. It might be the letters of St. Paul, or the philosophical writings of Boethius, or a history composed by a Roman author 6 centuries before your birth. The language might be Latin, which was the language of the church and the language most monastic manuscripts were written in. Or it might be Greek, which added an additional layer of difficulty for scribes who had not been trained in it. This is an important detail. A monk copying a text was not necessarily someone who understood what he was copying. This was, in fact, sometimes preferred. Scholars of medieval manuscript production have noted that the scribal tradition contained a real tension. Some teachers believed that understanding the text led to the temptation to correct it, to smooth it out, to improve it according to the scribe's own judgment. And an improved text was a changed text, which undermined the whole purpose. So some schools of copying encouraged a kind of deliberate incomprehension. Copying the shapes of the letters rather than their meaning, the way a skilled typographer might set text in a language they cannot read. This could produce transcription errors of a particular and memorable kind. A scribe copying a text in a language he did not know might mistake one letter for another that looked similar, or skip an entire line because his eye accidentally moved to the same phrase in the line below. Scholars studying surviving manuscripts can sometimes identify these errors and trace them backward, reconstructing not only what was written, but the moment a tired monk's eye slid one line too far down the page on a Tuesday morning in the year 800. The complaint margins. And then there are the marginalia. The margins of medieval manuscripts, the blank spaces around the main text, are one of the most intimate records we have of the inner lives of working people in the ancient and medieval world. Scribes wrote things in them. Little notes, little cries of frustration, little sighs pressed into parchment by a quill that had the same human weight behind it as yours does now. Some of the marginal notes discovered in surviving manuscripts are practical: corrections, variant readings, alternative phrasings. But others are deeply personal. Scribes wrote about the cold. "The cold is great," wrote one Irish scribe in his margin. "The wind is bitter and sharp." Another wrote of his hunger. Another complained about the light failing. One scribe, working late into the evening as the candles burned low, wrote something that translates approximately as, "Now I've written the whole thing. For the love of God, give me a drink." There is also a category of marginal notes that speaks to something deeper than physical discomfort. Medieval monastics developed a term for a particular psychological state that could afflict scribes: acedia. It was described by the early church writer Evagrius Ponticus and later by John Cassian, and it was taken seriously as a spiritual danger. The word is sometimes translated as sloth, but that translation does not quite capture it. Acedia was not laziness. It was a kind of creeping despondency that made work feel meaningless. A flatness that settled over the spirit, a sense that the sun was moving too slowly across the sky, that the day would never end. One source from Dartmouth's Ancient Books Lab describes it as a foul darkness, causing its sufferers to act anxious, apathetic, and hopeless, as if the sun was too slow in setting, which reads, in modern terms, remarkably like clinical depression. The scriptorium, quiet, confined, repetitive, was considered particularly prone to generating this state. And yet monks stayed. They continued copying. Some of them copied for decades, producing manuscripts that would survive 1,000 years after their deaths, preserving texts that would eventually be printed by Gutenberg's press and read by millions, the best ones. Not all scribes are anonymous in the historical record. A few stand out, not because of what they copied, but because of how they were remembered. There is Eadwine, a monk who copied manuscripts at Canterbury Cathedral around 1165. He was called the Prince of Scribes in the very manuscript that celebrated him. A surviving image shows him at his desk, and the text beside it praises his hand with an enthusiasm that reads as almost comic, given the subject. This man's handwriting was so admired that someone thought it worth commemorating. There is Diemut, a woman who worked as a scribe at Weserbrunn in Bavaria in the 11th century. She did not sign her manuscripts. Women's work in scriptoria was less likely to be formally credited, but her community valued her contribution so highly that they compiled a written list of every manuscript she had copied, a kind of posthumous register of her life's work. Dozens of texts, all produced in the quiet of her working hours, over decades. There is Otlo of Regensburg, who wrote about his own training and practice as a scribe in texts that survived. He described learning to write entirely on his own, becoming so skilled that his work was in demand not just in his home monastery, but in others across the region, to which he traveled to copy books. He described periods when the act of copying became so automatic, so absorbed into the body, that it felt less like work and more like a kind of prayer without words. though he also described periods of profound doubt about whether any of it mattered. The time it took. The scale of the enterprise is worth sitting with for a moment. A single book of moderate length, something like the New Testament, could take a skilled monastic scribe more than a year to copy. A larger text might take considerably longer. The inventory of a full monastic library could represent centuries of accumulated labor, each volume the work of a human life bent over a desk for 6, 8, 10 hours a day. At Malmesbury Abbey in 12th century England, a group of manuscripts was produced by up to 54 different scribes working together, including the historian William of Malmesbury, who coordinated the project. The goal was to produce a complete library of the most important texts the Abbey should own. A grand aspiration, quietly executed in a series of small acts of writing. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the 1450s changed this world irreversibly. A machine could reproduce in hours what a scribe had spent a year producing. The scriptoria that had been the nervous system of European learning for 9 centuries gradually quieted. The monks moved on to other duties. The desks stood empty, but the manuscripts remained. They remain now in libraries around the world. The British Library, the Bodleian at Oxford, the Vatican, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. You can visit them. You can look at pages that a particular tired person sat and wrote out on a particular cold morning, their breath slightly visible in the candlelit air. You can see where their hand wavered slightly on the word that marked the end of a long afternoon. In the margin of one manuscript, discovered by scholars and now quoted in histories of the period, a scribe wrote, "As the sailor longs for his home harbour, so does the scribe long for the last line." He got there eventually. So will you. Part 2. The Fuller. The smell you learn to ignore. Let us step out of the cool stone quiet of the scriptorium now, and into the warm, somewhat complicated air of a Roman city in the 1st century. The smell hits you first. This is perhaps the most honest thing to say about the Roman fuller. Before we understand what they did and why it mattered, we need to acknowledge that the first thing anyone knew about a fullonica, a fuller's workshop, was its smell. And the smell came from its primary cleaning agent, which was human urine. The Romans did not have soap. Soap, as a product made by combining fats with alkaline salts, was known in the Roman world, but was not widely used as a laundry agent until much later in European history. What the Roman textile industry had discovered, through the kind of patient empirical observation that characterizes most ancient technical knowledge, was that urine, specifically stale, fermented urine, contains ammonia. And ammonia is an excellent natural detergent. It breaks down fats and oils, lifts stains from wool and linen, and brightens the kind of white cloth that wealthy Romans considered a mark of status. The fullones, the workers in the fullonica, therefore had a direct and practical need for large quantities of urine. And they got it in the most straightforward way imaginable. They placed jars at street corners and asked the public to contribute. This was not unusual enough to be remarkable to a Roman passerby. A large jar sat at the edge of a street, and people going about their business used it. The fullo's workers then collected the jars when full and brought them back to the workshop. According to the Latin poet Martial, who wrote in the 1st century, this was a sight common enough in Roman cities to be worth satirizing. The Emperor Vespasian later formalized the arrangement by imposing a tax on the collection and sale of urine, which led to a famous exchange with his son Titus, who objected to taxing something so base. Vespasian reportedly held a coin under his son's nose and said that money did not stink. The Latin phrase pecunia non olet, money has no smell, entered the language and has remained there. What the work was. Now that we have established the central ingredient, let us talk about the actual work. The fullonica that archaeologists have most completely excavated is the fullonica of Stephanus in Pompeii, which was preserved by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. It was a converted private house. A family had lived there once, and the architectural bones of a home are still visible in the layout. But the atrium's central pool had been transformed into a large washing basin, and the rooms had been fitted with a series of smaller tubs, each set in a niche in the floor and surrounded by low walls. These small tubs, the treading stools, are where the main work happened. A fuller stood in the tub. The tub contained cloth, someone's toga perhaps, or a length of wool destined to be made into a cloak, soaked in a mixture of water, the collected urine, and in some cases an alkaline earth called simoleon clay. The fuller then did what you might already expect. He began to tread, to stamp the cloth underfoot, repeatedly pushing the cleaning agents through the fibers, scrubbing the oils and embedded grime loose through the combined pressure of his feet and the chemistry of the ammonia. The treading could last hours. It was called, with a deadpan Roman literalness, the saltus fullonicus, the fuller's jump. It was not a jump. It was a slow, rhythmic, repetitive stamping, the weight shifting from foot to foot as the cloth churned beneath. You are in this tub now, not as a free Roman citizen choosing this work, though some fullones were free and ran their own successful businesses, but perhaps as a hired worker or a slave. The distinction mattered enormously in social terms and barely at all in terms of the work itself. Your feet are wet. The smell around you is something that you have stopped noticing in the way that people who work in particular environments always stop noticing the defining characteristic of those environments. The wool beneath your feet is heavy, waterlogged, resistant. You have been doing this since the morning. The rest of the process. After the treading, the cloth was moved to large rinsing basins where fresh water washed out the cleaning agents and the loosened dirt together. The basins at the Follonica of Stephanus were fitted with channels that connected to the city's water supply. Rome's extraordinary network of aqueducts, which by the 3rd century included 11 separate systems supplying more water than the city of almost 1 million people could easily consume, kept everything flowing. After rinsing, the cloth was hung to dry. The Follonica had high beams inside for this purpose, and the cloth could also be laid in the street outside the shop. Roman law actually permitted fullers to spread drying cloth on the pavement in front of their establishments, a concession to the practical realities of the business. Then came the finishing. Dry cloth was brushed with a tool made sometimes from hedgehog skin, sometimes from the dried heads of thistles, to raise the nap, the soft surface texture of the wool. It was then sometimes treated with sulfur fumes to whiten it further, the cloth draped over a basket-like frame beneath which burning sulfur smoldered. Then simoleon clay might be rubbed into the surface to increase its brightness further before the final pressing. The result, after all of this, was a toga or tunic that looked genuinely white. Not off-white, not grey, not yellowed by wear and city air, genuinely white. This was the standard Romans of means expected, and the Follones delivered it every single time. The social world of the Follonica. The fullers occupied an interesting social position. On one hand, they were looked down upon. Roman snobbery toward those who worked with their hands, and especially toward those who worked with urine, was consistent and well documented. Cicero's political enemies sometimes teased him with the suggestion that his family had connections to a laundry business. The inference was that this should embarrass him. He apparently did not find it very funny. On the other hand, the fullones were indispensable. Everyone in Rome needed clean clothing. The wealthy certainly did. The gleaming white toga was a visual statement of status that could not be maintained without the Follonica. The poor needed their working clothes kept usable. The textile trade that produced new fabric needed the fulling stage completed before the cloth could be sold. Without the fullones, the city would quite literally have been shabbier, and successful fullones were not poor. The Phallonica of Stephanus was a profitable enough enterprise that when Vesuvius buried Pompeii, the skeleton of a man, presumed to be Stephanus himself, was found near the entrance, clutching a hoard of coins. He had apparently been trying to escape with the day's takings. His workers' guild in Ostia had its own formal organization, the Corpus Fontanorum. The Fullones of Pompeii apparently had their own informal social space, a house near their quarter with a large dining room covered in graffiti celebrating their trade. The scholar Mary Beard has suggested it may have been their after-work gathering place. All of these were people who, at some point in their working day, stood in a tub of diluted urine and stamped cloth for hours. Emperor Vespasian's tax and the legacy of clean cloth. The fuller's trade outlasted the Western Roman Empire by many centuries. After Rome's collapse in the 5th century, the fullones of the city simply kept working. Their occupation survived into the medieval period, adapting slightly as the technology slowly shifted. By the 12th century, water-powered fulling mills, where heavy wooden hammers driven by a water wheel did the treading work, began to spread across Europe, reducing the need for human feet in the tub. But the chemistry remained the same. The knowledge that ammonia removed oils from wool, discovered God knows how many centuries earlier by someone patiently observing what happened when certain substances interacted with cloth, was too useful to lose. The Roman fuller, standing in his tub, stamping slowly all morning long. He made Rome look clean. He never got much credit for it. Part 3. The water carrier, the weight that never changes. In ancient cities, in Egypt, in Rome, in the Greek world, in the great urban centers of Mesopotamia, someone had to move water. This sounds simple. It was not simple. It was one of the most physically demanding and logistically important occupations in the ancient world, and it was performed daily, in heat, by people whose names were almost never written down. Consider what a city without indoor plumbing actually requires. Every cup of water that is drunk, every cooking pot that is filled, every baby that is washed, every animal that is watered, every cistern that is kept full against the dry summer months, all of it had to arrive somewhere, transported by human hands, human shoulders, and human legs over distances that could be substantial. In ancient Egypt, the state managed this problem with remarkable organizational clarity. Archaeological and textual evidence from sites across the Nile Valley shows that the water supply of Egyptian settlements was almost entirely controlled and managed by local administrations, who employed water carriers to transport water from the river or from designated clean sources to distribution points within towns and cities. These distribution points were, essentially, communal drinking stations, installations equipped with clay jars in central squares or at key points throughout a settlement, replenished every day by the carrier network and monitored, apparently, by scribes who kept records of distribution. The village of Deir el-Medina, the community of workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, is one of the best documented examples. The village was located in a rocky valley, deliberately isolated from the main Nile settlements to protect the secrecy of the royal necropolis. It had no river access of its own. Its water came from carriers who made regular trips, filling their vessels from approved sources and returning to the village on a schedule that kept the community supplied. The carriers worked for the administration. They were employees of the state, in a world where the state managed water distribution as a matter of political and social necessity. Water in ancient Egypt was deeply political. Control of the Nile's flooding and the distribution of its water was one of the fundamental pillars of pharaonic authority. What they carried. It in the vessels themselves tell a story. In Egypt, water was carried in fired clay jars, heavy before they were even filled, heavier with water inside. The standard method of transport was to carry the jar on the back, tied in a net or sling of rope or cloth, with the load resting against the shoulders and spine. Larger quantities moved on the backs of donkeys, which extended the range and volume of what a single carrier could deliver in a day. In other parts of the ancient world, goatskin bags were common, an entire skin, sewn closed and sealed with pitch or resin, carried over the shoulder. These were lighter than ceramic when empty, roughly conforming to the body when full, and the gurgling weight of them as they were carried across sun-baked streets would have been a familiar sound in ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cities. The weight of a full water jar of moderate size, perhaps 15 to 20 liters, is roughly equivalent to carrying a large suitcase packed entirely with books. Now imagine doing that for a full working day. Walking to the water source, filling the vessel, walking back to the distribution point, emptying it, walking to the water source again. The path between the Nile and the village of Deir el Medina involved terrain that was not flat. It was rocky. It was steep in places. In summer, it was done in temperatures that could reach 40 degrees Celsius and above. The carriers who made this circuit, day after day, would have had a particular physical shape. Strong through the upper back and shoulders, calloused hands, legs that knew how to find footing on uneven ground without the thought of it. Rome's different answer. The Romans, with characteristic engineering ambition, eventually built their way around the need for water carriers, at least partially. The aqueduct system that supplied Rome by the 3rd century was in its time the most complex hydraulic infrastructure in the world. Rome's first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, was commissioned in 312 BCE. By the 3rd century, the city had 11 separate aqueduct systems, drawing from springs and rivers as far as 92 kilometers away, delivering water continuously into the city through gravity-fed channels that terminated at public fountains and baths, distributed throughout the urban fabric. This was an extraordinary achievement. The Pont du Gard in southern France and the Aqueduct of Segovia in Spain, both still partially standing, give a visual sense of the scale. The longest single aqueduct system associated with Constantinople, the city later called Istanbul, ran for an estimated 494 kilometers through the Thracian countryside, including bridges, tunnels, and settling cisterns, supplying a city that in the 5th century had a population approaching 500,000. And yet, even with all this engineering, water carriers did not disappear from Roman cities. The aqueducts fed public fountains, they fed baths, they fed the businesses and workshops that had formal connections to the supply. But the upper stories of the crowded tenement buildings, called insulae, where most of Rome's ordinary population lived, had no running water at all. Water had to be carried up from the public fountains below. So someone in each building, each household, made the trip. Down the stairs with an empty vessel, to the fountain at the end of the street, fill the vessel, back up the stairs. In a city of 1 million people, living in buildings that were sometimes 6 or 7 stories tall, this was happening simultaneously in thousands of locations every morning. The water carrier in the Roman city was both an occupation and a daily domestic reality for enormous numbers of people who might not have thought of themselves as performing a job at all. Just as a habit, a morning chore, the way things were done, the Sabil tradition and Cairo's water history. In Egypt, the tradition of the water carrier persisted with remarkable continuity. Long after the pharaohs were gone, long after Greek and Roman rule and the Arab conquest and the Ottoman period, water carriers were still moving through the streets of Cairo with their vessels. In the Ottoman period, public water dispensaries, called sabils, ornate stone buildings where water was given freely to passers-by, were built throughout Cairo by the wealthy as acts of piety, since providing drinking water was considered a deeply religious act in Islamic tradition. But behind the sabil was still the infrastructure of people who brought the water there and kept it filled. As one account from Cairo's water history describes it, carrying water was a career recognized by local authorities, with rules governing which sources water could be collected from and how it should be transported. These rules were not mere custom. They reflected genuine understanding that some water sources were safer than others, and that the health of an entire city could depend on which wells and canals the carriers drew from. This tradition of water carrying in Cairo lasted well into the 19th century. The establishment of the Cairo Water Company in 1865 and the slow spread of piped water to private homes over the following decades gradually reduced the need. By 1887, piped water had reached 3,600 of the roughly 5,500 homes in Cairo. The demand for water carriers diminished, but the tradition, thousands of years old, connecting the ancient workmen of Deir el-Medina to the streets of a 19th century city, took a very long time to fade. What it feels like you are on the path. The sun has been up for an hour and is already making its intentions clear. The vessel on your back contains about 15 liters of water, and you can feel the weight of it distributed across your shoulders in the practiced way that years of this work have produced. Your lower back is accustomed to this particular pull. Your feet know the ground. The city ahead of you is beginning to noise itself into wakefulness. A donkey is complaining somewhere. The smell of bread from a bakery. Children's voices, high and quick. You are bringing water. You will do it again this afternoon. You will do it again tomorrow. The water is the same water it has always been. The weight is the same weight. The path is the same path. But without you, the morning does not quite work. The bread does not bake. The pots do not fill. The children do not drink. You turn off the main road and toward the first distribution point. You have 4 more stops after this one.
Part 4. The Stone Movers. The Work Before the Wonder. There is a monument on the Giza Plateau in Egypt that has stood for approximately 4,500 years. It rises to a height of about 138 meters, originally about 146, before erosion and the removal of its casing stones over centuries reduced it slightly. It is made of roughly 2.3 million stone blocks. The largest of these blocks are granite beams hauled from the quarries at Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south, and weigh between 25 and 80 tons. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is, in raw physical terms, one of the most improbable things a group of human beings has ever accomplished. But this is not a story about the pyramid. It is a story about the people who built it, specifically about what their days were actually like. And their days were not, for the most part, moments of triumph. They were mornings, afternoons, evenings. They were the slow, incremental, physical accumulation of work that, over 20 years or so, happened to produce something that would still be standing when the farthest future we can imagine has come and gone. Who they were. For a long time, the popular image of the pyramid builders was slaves, vast numbers of enslaved people driven by whips under a merciless sun, building a monument to their oppressors' vanity. This image was propagated largely by the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BCE, more than 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, and recorded what his local guides told him. He was told that 100,000 workers labored for 20 years. Modern archaeology has dismantled this picture comprehensively. In 1988, the archaeologist Mark Lehner discovered and began excavating the workers' village at Giza, a settlement now known as Hayt el Ghurab. It is sometimes called the lost city of the pyramid builders. What it revealed was not a slave camp. It was a city, organized, supplied, and structured with the same administrative precision that characterized all of ancient Egypt's major state projects. 3 parallel streets ran through the settlement. There were barrack-style accommodations for rotating seasonal workers and stone-built private homes for the permanent skilled workforce. There were bakeries, large-scale industrial bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves per day. Archaeological estimates suggest that somewhere between 4,000 and 36,000 workers were present at various stages of the project, with the core permanent workforce numbering in the low thousands. To feed them, archaeologists estimate that roughly 11 cattle and 37 sheep or goats were slaughtered and consumed every day. The workers were not slaves. Current scholarly consensus, based on the administrative records, the burial practices, and the physical evidence of the village itself, is that they were Egyptian citizens fulfilling a form of state labor, a system called corvée, in which subjects owed periods of work to the state as a form of tax payment. Farmers who could not work their flooded fields during the Nile's inundation season came to Giza instead. Skilled artisans, stone carvers, masons, rope makers, ramp builders, held permanent positions and lived year-round in the village with their families. The workers were paid. Their compensation came in the form of food, housing, medical care, and the dignity of proper burial near the monument they helped build. The cemetery discovered near the village contains graves ranging from simple pit burials for general laborers to proper mud brick tomb structures for skilled workers and overseers. Some of the tomb markers carry hieroglyphic inscriptions listing the deceased's occupation: stonecutter, mason, transport specialist.
The gangs. The workforce was organized into named gangs, divided into smaller working units called files, a Greek word used by Egyptologists for what were essentially teams. Each gang had a name, often compounded with the name of the reigning pharaoh. Inscriptions found in the relieving chambers inside the Great Pyramid itself preserve some of these names. The Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaura. These were formal group identities worn with something that reads, across 4.5 millennia, like pride. Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, who excavated the workers' cemetery, noted that the naming and organizational structure of these gangs does not suggest slavery. It suggests something more like a sports team, a group with a collective identity, competing against other groups, taking ownership of their section of the work. What moving stone feels like. Now let us slow down. Let us be in the work itself. The limestone for the pyramid's body came mostly from quarries very close to the construction site, practically on the Giza plateau itself. The limestone was cut from the bedrock in rough blocks, each weighing an average of about 2.5 tons. Copper chisels and wooden mallets made the cuts. Sand was used as an abrasive. The cutting was slow, precise, and loud in its own way. Not loud in the way of modern machinery, but the repetitive sound of metal on stone, 10 hours a day, in a quarry full of men doing the same thing. Then the blocks had to be moved. The method most archaeologists now accept involved the use of wooden sledges and lubricated ramps. A 2014 discovery from the site of a nearby limestone quarry preserved an image from the Old Kingdom period showing workers hauling a sledge with a statue on it, with a man at the front of the sledge apparently pouring liquid from a vessel directly onto the path ahead. Research at the ancient quarry site of Hatnub in the eastern desert has supported the interpretation that water poured onto prepared paths of wet sand significantly reduced friction, enough to make moving extraordinary weights with teams of people pulling on ropes feasible. The granite beams from Aswan traveled a different route. A 2024 study confirmed what researchers had long suspected. A now dry branch of the Nile once ran much closer to the Giza plateau than the modern river does, and large stones could be floated on barges from the quarry sites downstream to a canal network near the construction site. Even with all of this, the work was brutal. Skeletal evidence from the workers' cemetery is unambiguous. Spines show compression damage consistent with carrying heavy loads over long periods. Knees show wear. Fractures in the arm bones, ulna and radius, were common, and most had healed, indicating that injured workers received treatment and survived. 2 individuals showed evidence of successful amputation, a leg in one case an arm in the other. The bone at the healed ends showed clean, deliberate cuts, indicating that Egyptian physicians performed these procedures with enough competence to save the patient's life. One stone at a time. You are part of a team of perhaps 20 men. You are pulling a rope. The rope is attached to a wooden sledge, and the sledge is loaded with a stone block that weighs more than 2.5 tons. The path in front of you is wet sand. Someone has been pouring water ahead of the sledge as it moves, and the sand darkens and compresses, reducing the resistance. You lean forward into the pull. The rope bites into your palms. Around you, the other men are leaning too, and for a moment there is a rhythm to it. A collective exhale, a collective heave, the faint scrape of the sledge moving forward by a meter, maybe 2, and then a stop to reset the grip and do it again. The sun is high. You have been doing this since the morning. The pyramid is not visible from where you are working. It is more of a sound, really, the noise of hundreds of men at their separate tasks spread across the plateau. You are one of the teams that brings blocks from the cutting area to the base of the ramp. Someone else's team will haul them up the ramp. Someone else will shape the stones into their final position. No one person builds the pyramid. 20,000 people over 20 years, each doing their piece, each pulling their rope, each moving their stone. By the end of the day, your shoulders ache in a specific way. Your hands are rough. There is stone dust in the creases of your face. You eat bread, beer, dried fish, and sleep in the barracks, packed alongside the other men of your file. Tomorrow the same stone will need to be moved, or a different stone. It is the same motion either way. Part 5. The messenger. The road stretching out. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to the long road. Not the dramatic loneliness of great literature, not the loneliness of exile or grief, but a simpler, quieter kind. The loneliness of being alone on a path, with no particular landmark to aim at, with only distance between where you are and where you need to be, and your own body to cover it. The hemerodromes of ancient Greece knew this feeling better than almost anyone. Hemerodromes, from the Greek words hemera, meaning day, and dromos, meaning running. Day runners. Their job was to carry messages by foot between Greek city-states across the mountainous, uneven, often treacherous terrain of the Greek peninsula. They were not athletes in the sense of people competing at festivals. They were professionals in the sense of people doing necessary work, the living nervous system of a civilization that had no telegraph, no postal service, no reliable way to move information from one place to another except by putting it in a human being and sending that human being to walk or run the distance. The training. A hemerodromos was not simply someone fast. He was someone trained to maintain speed over extraordinary distances without stopping. Ancient sources describe them as young men, not children, but in the range of late adolescence to early adulthood, who had been specifically prepared for this kind of sustained effort. What they carried with them was minimal. Accounts describe weapons, bow, arrow, spear, carried not for warfare, but for defense against the genuine dangers of the road. Wolves in the mountain passes, bears in the forested regions, and bandits who understood that a lone runner on an empty road was carrying either money or information, both of which were worth taking. Their diet, according to the ancient source, Grokopedia and other scholars of Greek athletics, included sea buckthorn fruit, figs, olives, dried meats, and a sesame honey mixture called pastelli that provided concentrated, portable energy. They could carry these provisions easily. They needed to. There was no guarantee of a food source along the route. Phidippides. The most famous hemerodromos in history is Phidippides, though his story is considerably more complex than the version most people know. The version most people know is this. In 490 BCE, after the Greek victory at the Battle of Marathon, a messenger ran approximately 40 kilometers from the battlefield to Athens announced the victory with the words, "We have won," Nenika Kamen in Greek, and then collapsed and died. This is the story that inspired the modern marathon race, which was introduced at the first modern Olympic Games in Athens in 1896. The problem is that this version of events was recorded by the writer Lucian, who was writing approximately 600 years after the battle. The earliest, most reliable account comes from Herodotus, who wrote within living memory of the people involved. And Herodotus tells a different story. In Herodotus's version, Phidippides was sent not from Marathon to Athens, but from Athens to Sparta. The purpose was urgent, to request Spartan military assistance before the battle even happened. The Persians had landed at Marathon, and the Athenian generals needed allies. Phidippides was dispatched to cover a distance of roughly 240 kilometers, Athens to Sparta, in as little time as possible. He arrived, according to Herodotus, on the second day. This means he covered 240 kilometers in approximately 2 days, which modern ultramarathon athletes have tested and confirmed is achievable by a very well-trained runner. Phidippides then ran back. He is described by Herodotus as an expert, meaning this was not an unusual feat for him, but a demonstration of practiced professional capability. He had done this before. He was good at it. The Spartathlon, a modern ultramarathon race run annually in Greece since 1983, follows the route from Athens to Sparta and covers approximately 246 kilometers. It has strict time cutoffs. Athletes from around the world attempt it each year, and many do not finish within the allowed time. Phidippides, if Herodotus is correct, did it barefoot, carrying weapons. What the long run feels like. You have been on the road for 6 hours. The terrain here is mountain, not the dramatic cliff-face mountain of artistic imagination, but the stubborn, boulder-strewn, scrubby kind. Grey stone and dry grass, and the smell of time when your foot crushes it by accident. The path descends into a valley and then rises again, and your body knows the rising differently from the descending, using different muscles, adjusting the weight distribution through your hips. The message you carry is written on a sealed tablet, or perhaps it is not written at all. Perhaps it exists only in your memory, committed word for word to the vault of your head, where no ambush can steal it. The Greek tradition of messengers sometimes included exactly this, a message divided between the written document and the messenger's verbal memory, neither of which was complete without the other. Your feet are bare or minimally shod. The ground tells you things through them, whether the surface is firm enough to push off hard, whether the dampness means the rock is slick, where the loose stones are. You are hungry. You ate a handful of dried figs a while ago, and you will eat again when you stop to drink at the next water source. You are not thinking about glory. Glory is not the word for this. You are thinking about the next 100 meters of path, and then the 100 after that. The distance between where you are and where you need to be is a number you are not thinking about directly. If you think about it too directly, it becomes a weight that slows you. Instead, you run to the next ridge, then the next bend, then the next flat stretch where you can open your stride and let the legs find their rhythm. In cities, people know nothing of this. In the city, information arrives and they receive it without thinking about the body that carried it. They read the message. They do not imagine the wet grass of a mountain pass at night, the sound of your own breathing louder than anything around you, the single-minded simplicity of having one task and enough left in your legs to finish it. After Phidippides, the Hemerodromos tradition continued well past the classical period. Alexander the Great employed a runner named Philonides. Ancient sources record that he was capable of covering 500 kilometers in exceptional circumstances, and he served as a rapid communication link between parts of Alexander's vast and mobile campaign territory. Across the ancient world, variations of the same solution existed wherever the need arose. Human beings trained to run or walk long distances, carrying information from one place to another because no better method had yet been invented. The Persian postal system, the Angarium, later adapted by the Romans into the cursus publicus, used relay stations where mounted riders could exchange horses and continue at speed, which was faster over long distances than any runner. But runners remained useful in terrain where horses could not go quickly, or where the message needed stealth rather than speed, or where no horses were available. The first telegraph was invented in 1837. Before that moment, for all of recorded human history, every message that needed to travel any distance was carried in a human being. Think of that the next time you send a text. Part 6. The Shepherd. The hill in the afternoon. This is the softest stop on our journey tonight. Find a hillside. Not a dramatic one, not a cliff or a peak, just a long, gradual slope covered in dry grass that has gone golden in the late summer, and scattered here and there with low, scrubby plants that smell faintly of pine and dust when the sun warms them. The view from here, if you stand and look, takes in a valley below where a river runs thin in the dry season, and on the far side another range of hills exactly like this one, and beyond those hills, more hills. It is very quiet. Somewhere below you, spread across the slope in a loose and apparently chaotic pattern that conceals an underlying organization, are the sheep. There are perhaps 40 of them. They are moving slowly across the hillside in the way that sheep move, not quite randomly, not quite intentionally, a collective drift that follows the grass rather than any plan. Their bells, small, flat-toned bells attached to their necks, produce a sound that is not quite musical, but is not quite noise either. It is somewhere between those two things, a kind of gentle percussion that has been the soundtrack of this hillside since early morning. You are the shepherd. You have been here since shortly after dawn. You will be here until the light begins to fail. The oldest job. Shepherding is among the oldest continuous occupations in human history. Historians and archaeologists estimate that the practice of keeping sheep, for wool, for milk, for meat, began roughly 5,000 years ago in the region of Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. Over the following centuries and millennia, sheep and the people who tended them spread across Eurasia and into Africa, becoming part of the agricultural foundation on which most of the world's settled civilizations were built. Wool was the textile of antiquity. Before cotton dominated European clothing, before silk became an object of trade across the Silk Road, wool was what most people wore. And wool required sheep, and sheep required shepherds, people willing to follow the animals through seasons and landscapes, watching over them in the hours when predators were most active, finding them water in the dry months, counting them every evening to see if any had wandered or been taken. In ancient Greece, shepherds were simultaneously marginal and essential. They lived at the edges of settlements, following their flocks into the mountains in summer and back to the lowlands in winter, a seasonal migration called transhumance, from the Latin trans, across, and humus, ground. Moving across ground, the same route, year after year, along the same paths worn into the landscape by the passage of countless previous flocks. Virgil's shepherds. The great Roman poet Virgil, writing in the 1st century BCE, composed a famous series of pastoral poems called the Eclogues, idealized visions of the shepherd's life that presented it as a kind of philosophical idyll. Shepherds singing to one another across valleys, making music on simple pipes, thinking quiet thoughts in the shade of ancient trees. This was, as ancient pastoral poetry always was, somewhat romanticized, but the idealization was not accidental. The shepherd's life genuinely contained something that the urban Roman life did not. Space, quiet, the long, slow movement of time through seasons rather than hours. The Roman agricultural writer Varro, who wrote extensively about farming practice, discussed the shepherd's dog at some length, specifically the livestock guardian breeds that protected flocks from wolves and thieves. He recommended white dogs so that the shepherd could tell them from predators in the half-dark of dawn. He discussed the feeding and housing of the flock. He described the shepherd's daily duties with a practicality that cuts through the pastoral poetry and arrives at something more honest. This was careful, attentive, repetitive work performed in isolation, with responsibility for living animals that could not advocate for themselves. Your dog. You have a dog. He is large and very white, which is the design. At this hour, with the sun behind the western hills, you can see him clearly even as the light shifts from gold to copper. He knows the sheep better than you do in some ways. He knows when one has drifted too far from the group before you do. He knows when something on the wind is not quite right, a smell, a movement in the brush below, and his response to that knowledge is immediate and physical, a low alert that travels from him to you like a current. His ancestors have been doing this work for as long as the breed can be traced, and the breed can be traced a very long way back. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, mentioned dogs of similar form guarding flocks in the region of Epirus in northwestern Greece. The Greek sheepdog, the Ellinikos pimenikos, is thought to be ancient in origin, one of the livestock guardian breeds that developed across the Mediterranean and Near East as human beings began keeping animals worth protecting. You and your dog have an understanding that does not require many words. He moves when you move. He positions himself where he is needed. When you whistle, a particular kind of whistle that shepherds across the Greek world have used for centuries, a language of signals developed to travel across hillsides louder than any spoken voice, he responds. What the hours are like. The hours on the hillside are long in a way that is particular to them. This is not the fast boredom of waiting for something to happen. There is no specific thing you are waiting for. There is no event on the schedule. The work is simply being here, present to the movements of the flock, aware of the perimeter, listening to the sounds of the hillside, the way you listen to a person you have known for years and can hear in their breathing when something is different. Most of the time, nothing is different. The sheep graze. The bells mark the rhythm of their slow movement. The wind comes and goes, warm in the late afternoon. A hawk circles overhead at some distance. Not an immediate threat to the flock, just a thing in the sky doing its own work. You have time to think. Shepherds across history have had more uninterrupted time to think than almost any other working person. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible, Moses, Amos, David, were shepherds before they were prophets. The image recurs in religious texts across traditions, the person at the periphery of society, away from the noise and urgency of the town, attentive to the more than human world in ways that people surrounded by human business could not be. The Gospels of the New Testament record that it was shepherds, men on a hillside at night, watching their flocks, who were the first people told about the birth of Jesus by an angel that appeared to them in the field. There is something in this image that speaks to what the pastoral world actually was, a place of attention, a place where the day moved at the speed of the light, and the light moved slowly, and you had time to notice what was there. Evening count. The light is fading now. The shadows of the hills have grown long and merged. It is time to bring the flock back in. You stand, and the dog moves before you even whistle. He has been watching the light too, and he knows. He begins his circuit around the edges of the spread-out flock, gently pressing the outliers back toward the center. The bells shift in tone as the sheep begin to move together, the individual notes merging into a sound that has no name but is distinctly itself. The sound of a flock being gathered. You count them as they pass through the narrow gate of the fold. 1, 2, 3, 4. You know the face of each one. You know the slightly lame one in the back, the way she holds one rear leg just slightly differently. You know the old ewe who always tries to go last. You know the small black-faced one that your daughter named and that you have been instructed not to make into anything edible. All present. You close the gate. Tomorrow you will open it again, and the whole of it will begin once more. The hill will be there. The grass will be there. The bells will start their slow music sometime after dawn, and you will be there with them, present to the hours, in a way that most of the world has forgotten how to be. Part 7. The bonus hours. The launderer's jump. One more stop before we reach the quiet at the end. Because we spoke about the fuller, the Roman laundry worker, in terms of their materials and their smell, but we did not quite spend time in the body of the work itself. Imagine the Phalonica in the middle of a Tuesday. The morning rush of drop-offs is done. Clients have left their clothing, togas bundled under arms, tunics handed across the counter, the occasional large piece of fabric from a weaver who needs it finished before it can be sold. The bundles are sorted by fabric type and degree of soiling, and the treading stalls are filling. A worker climbs into his stall. He is ankle-deep in water and diluted cleaning agent. The cloth is heavy beneath his feet, heavy in the way that wet wool always is, clinging and resistant. He begins to tread. Left foot down, weight transferred. Right foot down, left foot up, right foot pressing. The cloth shifts beneath him, churning slowly in the liquid. The motion is not fast. Speed is not the point. The point is consistent, even pressure distributed across the whole surface of the cloth, working the cleaning agent into every fiber, working the trapped oils and grime loose from the weave. This will continue for hours. The sound in the Phalonica, the squishing of feet in tubs, the running of water in the rinsing basins, the distant sound of cloth being brushed in another room, has a rhythm to it that you stop hearing after a while. It becomes the sound of the room, the same way the sound of breathing becomes the sound of the body, present but no longer noticed. The worker treads. He watches, without really watching, the cloth beneath his feet turning in the water. He has been doing this since he was old enough to be set to work in a Phalonica, and he will do it until his knees no longer cooperate. Rome will not remember his name. His togas, or rather, the togas he cleaned for other people, will not survive. The cloth is long gone, but the moment of his existence, standing in that tub on that Tuesday, is as real as any moment in history, as real as the battle, as real as the speech, as real as the painting on the ceiling of the chapel that will one day be considered one of the greatest works of art in human civilization. He treads, the cloth turns, the afternoon moves, the end of the day. History remembers kings and battles. It remembers the speeches given at the edge of crisis and the buildings that took a generation to complete. It has room in its great galleries of memory for the extraordinary, the rare, the violent, the transformative. But most people did not live in the extraordinary. Most people, for most of human history, woke up to an ordinary morning and did the thing they did. The thing that fed the city, cleaned the city, moved the water, carried the word, kept the flock, preserved the knowledge. The monk who bent over his manuscript and wrote, letter by letter, the text that would survive him by 1,000 years and reach you in some form tonight. He did not know he was doing something that would last. He knew he was cold and that the sun was slow to set. The fuller, standing in his tub in Pompeii on the morning before the mountain erupted, he did not know that his workshop would be found 2,000 years later, perfectly preserved under volcanic ash, the treading stalls still clearly readable, the evidence of his daily work legible to archaeologists who would find it astonishing. He knew that he had more cloth to get through before the afternoon was done. The water carrier making her circuit under the Egyptian sun, she did not know that the papyrus records of Deir el-Medina would eventually be found and studied, and that scholars would reconstruct from them a detailed picture of how the water supply of an ancient community was managed. She knew the weight of the vessel and the distance to the next stop. The stone mover who pulled his rope with his gang, the friends of Khufu or the drunkards of Menkaura, did not know he was building something that would still stand, unchanged in its essential form, when your civilization and every civilization after yours has come and gone. He knew he was tired, and that the bread at the end of the day was good. The Hemerodromos on the road between Athens and Sparta did not know he would eventually inspire a race run by 40,000 people every year in cities around the world. He knew the next ridge, and then the one after. The shepherd on the hill did not know that the image of the person at the edge of civilization, watching over what was alive and vulnerable, would become one of the most persistent metaphors in all of human religion and literature. He knew the sound of the bells as the flock settled for the evening. These are the quiet people, the ones the dramatic record forgets, and in forgetting them, the record misses most of what life actually was. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, as the edges of the day soften and the particular fatigue of your particular Tuesday or Wednesday or Saturday begins to settle into something more diffuse and gentle, know that you are joining a very long tradition of ordinary people at the end of an ordinary day. You did your thing today. You showed up. You did the work that was yours to do. And then, like every human being who has ever lived, you came to rest. The stone mover, the scribe, the fuller at his tub, the water carrier on her path, the runner on the mountain road, the shepherd at the gate counting his sheep. All of them eventually stopped. All of them put down whatever they were carrying. All of them rested. And so can you. The candlelight in the scriptorium has gone out for the night. The Phalonica is quiet. The hillside is empty, the bells still. The road stretches on in the dark, but no one is running on it. Good night. Sleep well. If you made it to the end of tonight's journey, thank you. Genuinely. You could spend your time anywhere, and you chose to spend it here, in these quiet old worlds, with these quiet old workers. If this kind of slow, careful history is something that helps you rest, please consider leaving us a like. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps this channel find its way to other people who might need a little of this same quiet. And if you haven't already, subscribe to History Lullaby. We'll be back with another evening of slow, true stories from the ordinary past. Until then, rest well.